Good morning, or actually 1 minute afternoon already. I'm very happy to be here, and we are really going to shift gears now. Human capital, that's people. So we're not talking about monetary units, we're talking about people units. So if you can please put on my slideshow. I'm going to introduce. Is it the next? Yes, here we go. Okay, good. So as was mentioned, I've been now for 20 years working in this Habsburg castle a bit outside Vienna, which is home of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. And 2 years ago, together with the University of Economics in Vienna, which is the biggest business school in Europe, and the Austrian Academy of Sciences, founded this Wittgenstein Center on Demography and Global Human Capital. So when we talk about human capital, of course, first they need to be human beings. So this is just a real long perspective. Throughout human history, there have been very few of us. The human species has always struggled with distinction through the famines, wars, diseases, and it was really only in the 19th century that in Europe populations started to grow because the death rates fell. And then, after World War II, the death rates fell all over the world, and that's why we have this skyrocketing, what some people term population explosion. And what you see at the very end now for the 21st century, this is the uncertainty range. We've just completed a major new effort of involving more than 500 population experts from around the world to see what are the best assumptions we can make today about population and education for the 21st century. So at the moment, we are somewhat above 7 billion people on this planet, and you see this is a probabilistic forecast. There's an uncertainty range, and you see a pretty big one, the 95% range really opens up, and the red line gives you the median, whereas half of the simulated cases above and half below, and that is likely to sort of reach a peak somewhere around 9 billion and then slightly decline before the end of the century. So the good news is here we do see the end of world population growth on the horizon. But the world is very different in different parts. Here you see Sub-Saharan Africa, where the population is momentarily about 800 million or so, and it's very likely to not only double, but even increase by a factor of 3, because the birth rates are still so high in Africa and the populations are still very young, which causes a lot of momentum in population growth. But in other parts of the world, in Eastern Europe, here you see already significant shrinking of the population. Some countries like Bulgaria on a fastly shrinking trajectory. They had 9 million people in 1990. Now they are down to 7.5, and they're likely to shrink below 6 million people by 2030. So Eastern Europe, because of very low fertility, because of out-migration, and because of still fairly high mortality rates, are in a shrinking conditions. And the question is whether Western Europe will also start to shrink, and this largely will depend on the balance of international migration in the future. But let's step back a bit, and it's not just the number of people that matters, but of course we have to start that economic growth must start with the study of the people who produce it, with our own hands or through designing, building, and operating the machines or institutions that make it possible. But this is where the demographers come in. Economists sometimes assume that all the people are somehow equal in their behavior, they are not heterogeneous. But we do know that people do not come as an amorphous mass. Not every member of a given population makes the same contribution to the economy. It seems trivial, but many of the economic models do not include this trivial fact. So as demographers, we typically differentiate people by their age, their sex, and now in our studies also systematically by educational attainment, but we'll also look at health status, labor force participation, and then some other dimensions which are more of a cultural or psychological nature, more difficult to measure. But then, of course, if we talk about innovation, some people tend to be more innovative, have more new ideas than others, and so on. So there are many differences among people, and in our models need to try to capture them. So now we'll only focus on the educational attainment dimension because it's the easiest to measure. And as Jeff has told us this morning, really we need to have data, we need to have measurement on the table in order to be taken serious. So when we talk about human capital, so it's the people, it's their education, and it is the health. And education, it's important. We have formal education and informal. Informal education is all learning that takes place outside schoolrooms. And again, it's quite important, the quantity of education, the years of schooling is only one dimension. We have quality and content. What are we learning in school? And particularly in the context of unemployment here in Spain and other European countries, it really also matters what have we learned in school? How useful is that what we've learned in school? And when we talk about formal education, typically the policy variable is education flows. How many people are currently in school? What are the school enrollment rates? And so on. But when we talk about human capital, what we mean is the stock. How many adults are there with what level of skills? And this is very important to know. The stocks change only very slowly due to a great momentum. And the education flows only change that at the margin. We can measure that as mean years of schooling, but my preferred measure here that we've now reconstructed for all countries in the world is the distribution by highest level of educational attainment as well as age and sex. So we've heard about Singapore, so we have this for all countries in the world, and since I've also just spent a month as a visiting professor at the National University of Singapore, this is a pyramid. You've probably seen age pyramids. You have women on the right and men to the left, sorted by age groups here. The young at the bottom, the old at the top, and now we added color. Red means never been to school. Yellow means some primary education, light blue completed junior secondary, and dark blue tertiary education. So this was Singapore in 1995, when I came there for the first time, and I really found a divided society, but divided not by social classes, but by age cohorts, by generations. As you see, like women above the age of 45, most of them are red. They've never been to school. While at the same time, the young cohorts, they're among the best educated in the world already in 95. How can this be? Well, that's demographics. When these women in their 50s and 60s were of school age, then in the 1950s and 60s, Singapore was still a terribly poor developing country. At that point, actually poorer than Kenya and Uganda. So we reconstructed back to 1970. This was the age and education pyramid for Singapore in 1970. And I'm showing you this just to show how the dynamics of social change always comes from the bottom with new generations, with new characteristics here, better education, then moving up the age pyramid. So 1970, most of the Singaporean women above age 30 were uneducated. And only in very recent cohorts, education had started. And now we move in 5-year steps. So every year, this is moving up, 75, 80, 85. Now you see better educated men and women coming into young adult ages. And these are precisely the years when Singapore experiences phenomenal economic growth, as well as improvements in governance and public health. Malaria was eradicated, and so on and so on. It's all attributable to a large extent, in my view, to these better educated cohorts moving into responsible positions. 1995. Now you see also that because women are better educated, the pyramid is getting more narrow at the bottom. Fertility rates decline. 2000, 2005, 2010. So here we are now, one of the best educated young populations. More than about 70 to 80% have some sort of post-secondary education in Singapore, but still among the elderly women, a large proportion without any formal schooling, never having been in school. So this shows you the momentum of improvement in human capital due to the flows only happening at the bottom and the stock only very gradually changing and moving up. And this phenomenon has also been called demographic metabolism. In a way, a society changing through the old ones dying off and new ones who are different in many respects moving up. Okay, this is 2015, 20, 25. Now you see, of course, some people are scared because the basis gets so narrow. This is population aging. This is the very low fertility. And this is now a question we may discuss in the following discussion session. The key also in European countries is whether the smaller number of young people that we have can be compensated or possibly even overcompensated through their higher skill level, to their better education, through their higher human capital. And actually there are many indications that this may indeed be the case, that indeed population aging is not such a big problem as many people tend to think. And this really changes when we factor in education and not only look at the age distribution and otherwise assume everybody is equal. Okay, China. They have really taken Singapore in a way as a role model. Now here we have the same colors, but this back projection to 1970 and then projections for the 21st century. You see that the gray are people below the age of 15, and otherwise red is those without education, which in China in the 70s and 80s was almost half of the adult population. But China has so massively invested in the 80s into universal primary education and then even secondary and tertiary education that by now there are only very few uneducated elderly left. And look at this light blue, far more than half of the Chinese labor force today already has secondary education. And again, I believe this has been really the basic underlying driver of this phenomenal economic growth that we've seen in China. And then to the future, yes, population will reach a peak, maybe in 10, 15 years, and then start declining because of very low birth rates. But the education will be much higher. And again, the question is, will this aging and population decline really pose an economic problem, or wouldn't they be able, through high tech that requires less labor input but higher skills, to compensate this? India, we'll hear more about India, is actually quite different from China. You see now India today, almost half of the adult population, particularly the female education, red, without any formal education. In India, government has made efforts recently to expand, but they are 20, 30 years behind China in the expansion of the education system. And this is an optimistic scenario that they will increase the school enrollment rates, and therefore, in the around 2050 or so, they will be probably in the same position that China will be in the near future. But a big lag behind China and a longer growing population. Now we have these pyramids for different scenarios that I showed you. This is the current situation. In India, still female education in India much worse than male education. And this is the optimistic global education trend scenario to the right, that indeed they will be catching up. But if we have constant enrollment rates, that's the scenario here on the left, the SARE, then the constant unsatisfactory situation will be frozen, and India in 2060 will be not very well off. They will still have very, very large numbers of uneducated men, and particularly women. And this is the most optimistic to the right, the fast track scenario, that they would now, as of tomorrow, embark on a Singaporean or Korean route of school extension. Then they could look like Singapore does today, maybe within a half century. So again, this is the momentum, but it all depends on the near-term investments in education. This is a very complex slide. This is our new estimation of migration streams, because when we talk about flow, it is also not only the building up of human capital within a country, it's also the international movement, and there's not good data out there. So in my institute, we have now really re-estimated the bilateral flows. Here you see between regions, so the color gives you the region where it comes from. So up here, you see, for instance, North America, and this light blue is from Central America to North America. And we have these estimated migration flows now by level of education, and that makes a big difference. But we don't really have time, maybe in the discussion, to go into this. I'm now going to talk very briefly about an effort where we still increase the dimensionality. So far, we've talked about age, sex, and education. Now we are adding on labor force participation and health, and possibly even migrant status, 5 to 6 dimensions, because they all matter for human capital. This was done for the Austrian Chamber of Industry, so I'm sorry that it is in German language, but what it shows is labor force participation rates. You see age at the bottom for women, for different education groups. Red, again, is the lowest education category, and here you see that women, once they have children in their 20s or early 30s, partly drop out of the labor force. They have a much lower labor force participation rate than the women of the same age if they have intermediate or high level of education. Blue again here is some tertiary education. Very interesting also when you look at the age of retirement. In almost every country we looked at, the more educated not only work to a higher extent, but they also retire much later. And since the future elderly are likely to be better educated, we can also expect a further increase in the age of retirement, just as the changing composition by level of education. This is by country of birth in Austria. So these are all the people. It's not really a pyramid because you need to be born outside the EU 27 in order to be on this chart. What I wanted to show here, the vast majority are red. They have the lowest educational group. So in countries like Austria and Germany, but in many other European countries, really, migration so far has mostly been low-skill migration. And now the The politics is interested what would be the implication of having different migration scenarios. One, what we call qualified entry, the red line, that you only let in people who have at least high school graduation or tertiary education. And we see what would it do to the average composition in the population of those who belong to these highest two education categories. And you see, yes, over time, just only the flow of migrants being steered into the direction of higher qualification would help to increase the overall proportion with higher education from currently 26 to 32% in Austria. And the constant one, where we have less educated migrants, actually would depress somewhat the overall improvement in education. Now, final word on world population. Science magazine has recently done a major review of global population trends, and we had an article there showing that indeed, if you assume identical birth rates for women in these different scenarios, but we know that women with higher education have lower birth rates, then the fast-track scenario, for instance, here, which has much better education in the future, only results in a world population of less than 9 billion, whereas the constant rate scenarios reach almost 10 billion people. So in other words, even with assuming the same fertility trajectories, only investing more in education will also help to reduce the world population growth to more sustainable levels, even over this next 4 decades. We don't have time now, but we've now, using these back projections, had extensive new econometric studies where we indeed could statistically finally resolve this puzzle that economists had struggled so long with, that on the individual level, there's no doubt that more education gives you more income. But on the aggregate level, it couldn't be shown, also it was expected, that higher average education enhances economic growth. And the problem was that they took this very crude measure of mean years of schooling of the entire adult population. If you remember Singapore, there you have very highly educated young adults and uneducated elderly. If you average over them, then you get sort of an intermediate number that has very little statistical signal. Once we do it by 5-year age groups, we can beautifully demonstrate that it is when these better educated cohorts come into the main working ages that then economic growth takes off, and it's really the universal, broad-based secondary education that makes the decisive difference. Well, education and health, again, even at very old age, you see at the age of 75, for instance, more educated women here in Austria have only half the probability of being disabled than the less educated. So education is not only good for the economy and for your income, but also for your health. Well, this cheers up people, so that's going to be my last slide here. We also studied some special populations, and the members of academies around Europe do have excellent records for long times. What is the longevity of academicians? And we compare them to the average Austrian population. Here, it's the life expectancy at the age of 60. And you see the blue line is the total population in Austria, very little increase, and the academicians are not any better off. They have about the same life expectancy at the age of 60. But then, after 1950, really the life expectancy at 60 started to increase for the total population. It increased even more for the population with tertiary education, so the people who went to universities. But look at these lucky people who continue to use their brains until very high age. And there's a very new evidence that it's really the continued mental activity at high ages that keeps you productive and also keeps you alive. Well, I think I stop with this rather encouraging remark, and I have more information, but maybe my time is over and we can have discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.